You know how it is you want to get your head around something really important, but sometimes there's just uh, so much information out there, it can feel a bit overwhelming.
Totally. Information overload is real.
That's kind of where we come in. Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take a stack of sources, find the crucial insights, the stuff that really
So
matters.
you get well informed and pretty fast.
Exactly. And hopefully, find a few interesting connections along the way.
That's the plan. We're basically trying to build a shortcut to understanding complex topics. We do this sifting for you.
We find the core knowledge, the big shifts in thinking that, well, have shaped things.
Yeah, how we got to where we are now.
So today we're taking a deep dive into a period that honestly still echoes today, the Enlightenment.
A really pivotal time.
And we're looking specifically at how this huge intellectual, cultural transformation really reshaped Christian mission thinking and practice, too, over the last, 3 centuries.
Yeah, it's a long shadow. Our main source for this is an excerpt called 01 Mission in the Wake of the Enlightenment.
Right.
And understanding this connection, it's not just history for history's sake. It's kind of like looking at the DNA of global Christianity today.
How so?
Well, it shows how this massive change in how people thought about, well, everything, really, influenced a movement that literally went global.
Okay, so to really get the impact, we probably need to step back first. What was the world like before the Enlightenment kicked off? What was the basic worldview?
Good question. The dominant view was really centered on a divinely ordained hierarchy.
Hierarchy, meaning?
Imagine like a ladder, a cosmic order, God right at the very top.
Okay.
Then under God, the church, then royalty, kings and queens, and then sort of down through society's layers.
So everyone had their spot.
Pretty much a pre-assigned place in this big structure. And the really crucial thing to grasp is that challenging this structure wasn't just, politics or social disagreement.
It was more than that.
Oh, yeah. It was seen as questioning God's will directly, which makes the changes that came later incredibly significant. A huge deal.
So a very rigid system then, fixed places.
Absolutely. The big emphasis was on staying in your God-given station in life. Don't rock the boat.
And the church's role in this.
Vital. The church was central in legitimizing this whole structure. It acted as the main go-between, between God and people.
And therefore between God and the rulers, too.
Exactly. Validating their power.
But then things started to shift, didn't they? You have the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Age of Revolution. How did those start to, crack that old order?
Yeah, those were huge transformative periods. They gradually chipped away at the authority of both the church and the royals.
Okay.
The Reformation, for instance, it fractured the unity of the Western church, challenged its single ultimate authority. Power dynamics started changing. Validation, like where legitimacy came from, it moved from God, making more towards the king for a while. But then, crucially, during the Age of Revolution, even the monarch's authority got seriously questioned and limited.
So power starts moving downwards?
In a way, yeah. Ordinary people began thinking about a more direct link to God, maybe one not totally controlled by the church or the king. You could see the early seeds of democracy there.
And then science enters the stage. How did that fit in?
Right, the developing age of science. That further reduced the church's role as the ultimate stamp of approval on how society worked.
People started noticing things worked without direct church say-so.
Exactly. People saw that society could function, even progress, pretty much independently of explicit religious approval. That was a massive realization.
I can imagine.
And as those sort of supernatural authorities, God, church, royalty, started to fade in influence, people began looking for validation somewhere else.
Where did they look?
Interestingly, sometimes kind of downward. Towards the natural world, observable things, animals, plants, the universe itself, trying to find meaning and authenticate their existence there.
Instead of looking up to God or the king.
Precisely. Deriving their sense of being, their validity, from the subhuman level, you might say, rather than from above.
Wow, that's a fundamental flip. Okay, so what were the key features, the main ideas of this new Enlightenment thinking that came out of all that disruption?
There are several really core ones. First, and maybe the most central, is the primacy of reason.
Okay, human reason taking center stage.
Totally. Thinkers like Copernicus, Bacon, Galileo, Descartes, Locke, Newton, they all put immense value on autonomous human reason. our ability to figure things out on our own.
Two main strands there, right? Empiricism and rationalism.
Yeah, exactly. He had Bacon's empiricism focus on observation, experiments, what we can sense.
Gathering data.
Right. And then Descartes' rationalism, highlighting the power of pure thought, logic, deduction. But both really emphasize that humans could understand the universe through their own intellect.
And how did this focus on reason affect the relationship between science and faith? Was it immediate conflict?
Not necessarily, not at first. Initially, many of these big thinkers, like Bacon, for example, they didn't see a fundamental clash between their discoveries and their Christian faith.
They saw harmony.
Often, yeah. They believed you could study God's creation, the book of nature, as a way to better understand God, the creator. Harmony was the ideal for many.
But that changed.
It did. In the generations that followed, science and faith were increasingly seen as, well, potentially opposed. As scientific explanations grew, they sometimes seemed to offer alternatives to the traditional religious ones.
Okay. And this massive emphasis on reason, how did that specifically hit Christian theology itself?
Well, reason just gained this huge, unprecedented importance within theology, too.
More important than the faith sometimes.
In some circles, yes.
Yeah.
It started to be prioritized over faith, or at least put on an equal footing in a way it hadn't been before.
Which is different from earlier views.
Very different. Earlier traditions often saw faith as a distinct way of knowing, maybe even a higher form of reasoning. The reasoning of the religious mind, as some put it. Faith usually held the top spot when it came to ultimate truth.
Okay, got it. Reason first.
Right.
What's the second key characteristic? You mentioned the subject-object scheme. What's that about?
Right, the subject-object scheme. This was another huge shift. The Enlightenment really drew a sharp line between humans in the thinking subject, the res cogitans, as Descartes called it,
Thinking substance.
and the environment, the non-human world, the res extensa, or extended substance.
So us versus everything else.
Pretty much. And this wasn't just abstract philosophy. It fundamentally changed how people related to the natural world.
How so?
Suddenly, nature wasn't necessarily something you were part of or that could teach you things directly. It became something separate, something to be studied, analyzed, maybe even controlled.
An object.
Exactly, an object for analysis,
Yeah.
looked at with scientific detachment.
A more, objective, less connected way of seeing things.
Precisely. And this kind of objectifying wasn't just limited to nature. The focus shifted generally, from understanding how things are interconnected, the whole picture, to dissecting things, analyzing the individual parts.
It's like reductionism.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
With this underlying assumption that the parts were somehow more fundamental, more real than the whole.
And this applied to studying humans, too.
It did. It influenced how humans were studied, breaking us down. Thinking beings for philosophy, social beings for sociology, physical bodies for biology, and so on. Even the human subject could become an object of study in this way.
What were the real-world results of seeing things this way? Subject versus object.
Well, it fueled this tremendous confidence, this belief in humanity's ability to, well, take charge of the earth, to occupy it, subdue it.
Sounds like it powered exploration, colonialism.
Absolutely. That mindset was behind the discovery, in quotes, of new lands, setting up colonial systems. There was this feeling that the real world was only just being properly understood now.
And old ways were maybe holding things back?
Yeah, that past traditions were maybe obstacles to progress. The physical world was seen more and more as raw material, something to be managed, exploited for human benefit.
Right. I think the source mentioned something about breaking the ancient tyranny of matter.
Exactly. That phrase captures the feeling, this belief that humans could now create new possibilities, almost shape reality at will.
Okay. And the theological impact. How did this subject-object split play out in religion?
Well, that separation started getting applied to studying theology, too. People became much more aware of history, of the time gap between them and, say, biblical times.
It's historical distance.
Right. It created the sense of a gap, a chasm. Lessing famously called it an ugly ditch, separating modern readers from the original meaning of Scripture.
So it became harder to connect.
It created a risk, definitely. A risk of treating the Bible or tradition as just another object, something to be analyzed critically, maybe dissected historically, but not necessarily something that speaks with authority to you, the subject, today.
Interesting. Okay, the outline also flags the elimination of purpose teleology. What changed in how people thought about cause and effect?
Right, teleology. Before the Enlightenment, Greek and medieval thought often worked with this idea of animated causality.
Meaning things had built-in goals.
Yeah, inherent purposes or ends, like an acorn's purpose is to become an oak tree. That was seen as a kind of cause. The Enlightenment, though, it pushed for a science that was deliberately non-teleological.
Science shouldn't ask why in that sense.
Exactly. Science stopped being concerned with the ultimate why of the universe or any grand divine plan. It focused instead on direct mechanistic causality.
Like billiard balls hitting each other.
That's the classic analogy, yeah. One cause directly, predictably leads to an effect. Very mechanical.
So a much more deterministic view, less room for overarching purpose.
Increasingly so, yes.
Yeah.
The basic idea was, if you could just understand the whole chain of cause and effect, you could explain everything, maybe even predict it.
And humans are the ones figuring this out.
The human mind started to be seen as the master planner, the one capable of understanding, anticipating, maybe controlling events.
So things become less mysterious.
Yeah, natural events, birth, illness, death, and even social stuff, they gradually lost some of that perceived mystery. They were increasingly seen as just biological or sociological processes governed by laws we could discover.
And the tension with Christian faith there seems, well, pretty obvious. Faith is all about purpose, right?
Absolutely. Christian faith is fundamentally asking that wherefore question. What's the purpose of life? What are God's intentions? The Enlightenment's move away from purpose created a huge tension.
Human planning versus relying on God.
You could put it that way. Human planning and control increasingly took the place, in some ways, of trust in divine providence.
Okay. Next big one, the belief in progress. This feels like the defining characteristic of the Enlightenment for many people.
It really was. And it was such a dramatic shift from how people often viewed history before.
How so? What was the older view?
Often, earlier views looked back to a lost golden age, or saw history as cyclical, repeating patterns. Think of Dante, viewing Ulysses wanting to sail beyond the known world as, like, dangerous pride, hubris.
But the Enlightenment saw that differently.
Totally differently. For the Enlightenment generation, that same spirit exploration, discovery, both geographical and intellectual, that was exciting. It showed humanity's potential for advancement.
An upward curve.
Exactly. There's this widespread conviction that humanity was on an upward path, capable of constantly improving the world, making things better.
How did this belief in progress actually, show up in the real world?
Oh, it was powerfully expressed in things like the development programs that Western nations started, especially later in what became the Third World.
Based on Western ideas of progress.
Heavily. They pushed Western technological and economic models. Big emphasis on material wealth, consumerism, economic growth, modernization.
And the assumption was this was the only path.
Pretty much. The underlying assumption was that this Western model was the inevitable linear path of progress for everyone, and that the benefits would eventually trickle down to all societies.
And if you weren't on that path,
you were seen as backward, a state that needed fixing, needed to be brought up to speed with the West.
Right. And the theological side of this, how did this powerful belief in progress connect with Christian thinking?
Well, that optimistic spirit, you can definitely see echoes of it in modern theology.
In what way?
You see it in ideas about Christian values gradually winning out in the world. Sometimes it looked like expecting a future global triumph for Christianity.
Like converting everyone.
Either through conversion, yeah, or through the church reforming society, fixing injustice, basically building the kingdom of God on earth, often conceived in ways that looked a lot like Western progress.
Aligning God's kingdom with Western civilization.
There's definitely a growing tendency to do that, yeah.
Okay, another interesting split mentioned is fact versus value. How did the Enlightenment draw that line?
Right. This was key. The Enlightenment really pushed this idea that scientific knowledge was about facts. And facts were seen as, well, value-free, neutral, objectively true.
Things you could prove, regardless of opinion.
Exactly. Facts just were. Verifiable through observation, reason, independent of what anyone believed or what culture they were from.
And values. Where did they fit?
Values were put in a different box. They were seen as subjective, matters of opinion, personal belief, maybe cultural preference, not objectively true in the same way facts were.
So where did that leave religion, like Christianity? Was it fact or value?
It mostly got put in the values category, seen as subjective, a private matter, separate from the objective public world of facts, which was science's domain.
So Christianity becomes one option among many?
That framework certainly helped that view along. Christianity is seen as one religion among others, each representing a different set of values.
Which leads to tolerance, maybe?
It definitely helped create an intellectual climate for religious tolerance, alongside science being dominant. Religious beliefs weren't really expected to challenge the scientific facts of the world.
Or religion retreats.
That was another response, yeah. Some religious thinkers reacted by focusing only on transcendent spiritual values, things completely separate from the messy material world that science dealt with.
Okay. Then there's the idea that all problems are solvable. That sounds incredibly optimistic.
It absolutely was a profound conviction that basically any challenge humans faced could eventually be solved.
How?
Through applying reason and mastering the relevant facts, science was seen as this cumulative thing, always growing, always getting better as we gathered more data.
Building on itself.
Right. And the story often told was that history was moving from the dark ages of speculation and superstition
Yeah.
to the triumph of the positive sciences. Empirical, rational knowledge winning out.
And how did that confident problem-solving attitude hit theology?
Well, it directly challenged things like miracles, didn't it?
Yeah.
Or anything else that couldn't be explained by natural laws.
If everything can be explained eventually.
Then where does God fit in?
Yeah.
God's role started getting pushed into the gaps in scientific knowledge. The God of the gaps.
Only needed for what we don't understand yet.
Exactly. And as science explained more and more, the perceived need for God, for divine intervention, seemed to shrink for some people.
Leading to secularization.
Yes, some theologians even began to embrace secularization, saw it as a natural, maybe even good outcome of human progress and knowledge.
Okay, final core characteristic. The emancipated autonomous individual. How did the Enlightenment change the view of the individual person?
This was another massive shift from the Middle Ages, where the community, the group, was often primary.
Right, your identity came from your group.
The Enlightenment really elevated the individual, their inherent value, their self-sufficiency.
Autonomous individual.
Yeah, individuals seen as beings with reason, free will. Personal liberty became this almost sacred right, inviolable.
And you didn't need external validation anymore.
Less so. The traditional need for God or the church to legitimize your status, your worth, that diminished. The idea took hold that all individuals were born equal.
With rights.
With natural rights. Rights inherent just by being human, not granted by religion or the state.
So real focus on individual agency, self-determination.
Yes. Though it's really important to add that this was often the ideal.
Not always the reality.
Definitely not. In reality, individuals could still be and were terribly degraded and exploited, even while these ideals were being talked about.
And the theological impact of this individualism.
It fueled a huge rise in individualism within Protestantism especially.
How so?
The church as an institution became maybe less central for some. Individuals felt more empowered to interpret the Bible for themselves, figure out God's will on their own.
More emphasis on personal faith.
Exactly. Personal faith, individual belief decisions became much more prominent.
Okay, wow. That's a really thorough tour of the core Enlightenment ideas. So now let's bring it all together, the main event. How did all this thinking fundamentally reshape Christian mission? The thinking behind it, the practice of it.
Yeah, the impact was, well, transformative is the right word. You could argue that the modern missionary enterprise, the way we often think of it from the 18th, 19th centuries onwards,
Yeah.
is largely a child of the Enlightenment.
Because of that expansion.
Exactly. That expansionist worldview, that confidence, that drive to go out, it propelled European influence globally. And Christian mission was deeply caught up in that.
Even the word mission.
Yeah, even the term mission itself became really tied up with that whole narrative of Western outreach. And let's be honest, it's a very complex relationship with empire.
Okay, let's dig into some specific areas then. What about the relationship between church and state? How did that changing relationship affect missions?
Right. So you had this shift from that really close, often symbiotic church-state relationship
Or they worked hand in glove?
to a greater separation, at least in theory, defining separate spheres, the secular and the religious.
And that changed how people saw spreading Christianity and expanding empires.
It did. Before, they were often seen as almost the same goal, or at least tightly linked. Now, they became more distinct concepts.
But maybe not always distinct in practice.
Well, exactly. And interestingly, a movement within Protestantism, Pietism, actually contributed to this separation in mission work, though maybe unintentionally.
How did Pietism do that?
Pietism put a huge emphasis on the inner life, personal conversion, the soul. It sometimes drew a sharp line between saving souls and dealing with bodies or social structures.
So missions focused more narrowly on the spiritual.
Often, yes. focusing primarily on the spiritual salvation of individuals, sometimes separate from broader social or political concerns.
Okay. And what about the big religious revivals, the evangelical awakenings? They seem like they were pushing back against the Enlightenment's cold reason, right?
They absolutely were, in many ways, a reaction against what they saw as dry rationalism.
But were they also shaped by the Enlightenment?
Oh, definitely. They were deeply influenced by its emphasis on the individual experience, individual decision for Christ.
And Methodism, for example.
Yeah, Methodism embraced this incredible vision of the whole world as its mission field. John Wesley's famous line, "The world is my parish."
Blurring the lines between home and away.
Completely. That was a huge departure from the older idea of a defined Christendom. These awakenings also sparked this new energy, this optimism about spreading Christianity globally.
What about the reasons why people went? The motivations for mission, did those change?
Yes, the emphasis shifted somewhat. The glory of God was always there, of course.
Sure.
But missionary motivations increasingly started to include things like addressing human needs, showing Christ's love in practical ways, rescuing the lost from hell, but also promoting social reform based on Christian principles.
The beginnings of the social gospel idea.
Exactly. That starts emerging more strongly here.
And how did missionaries influenced by these Enlightenment ideas view the people they were going to, the non-Western cultures?
That's really complex and often contradictory, frankly.
In what way?
Well, early on, some Enlightenment ideals about universal human reason could lead to feelings of empathy, solidarity, seeing non-Western people as equally loved by God, having inherent worth.
But that wasn't the whole story.
Not at all.
Yeah.
Alongside that, you also had pessimism, or sometimes romanticized, unrealistic views of other cultures, often filtered through a very Western lens.
And later.
Over time, especially as colonialism really took hold, there was a growing tendency towards pessimism and, frankly, ideas of Western cultural superiority, sometimes even racial superiority, sadly.
Fueled by biased science and conquest.
Yeah. Scientific ideas were often interpreted through these biased lenses, reinforcing those hierarchies.
Okay. And that Enlightenment focus on the individual, how did that play out in mission practice?
It meant the focus often narrowed, increasingly centered on saving individual souls.
Rather than, say, transforming a whole community.
It's exactly. Individual salvation over community transformation became a much more dominant theme, especially in the 19th century. The missionary's job was to preach the gospel, call for personal conversion. That really reflected the Enlightenment's individualistic core.
Now, the whole civilizing and Christianizing thing, that sounds problematic today. How did the Enlightenment feed into that?
Yeah, it's deeply problematic from our perspective. The belief really took hold that Christian nations, especially Western ones, were sort of the peak of civilization and history.
The most advanced.
Right. So mission was often framed as this project to uplift supposedly culturally backward peoples to a higher level.
Which meant making them more Western.
Often, yes. Civilized life was almost always equated with Western cultural norms. And those norms got dangerously mixed up with what were seen as universal Christian values and progress itself.
That's a key point, that conflation.
It's absolutely critical. Mixing up Western culture with Christian essentials had huge, often negative consequences for the people they encountered.
And that sounds like it leads straight into paternalism, doesn't it? Treating people like children.
Exactly. Even when the stated goal was to establish independent, self-governing local churches, there was often this pervasive attitude of, well, benevolent paternalism, we know best. And that often undermined the goal of independence, creating dependency instead.
Were there debates within the missionary movement about this? Like, what should come first? Preaching or building schools?
Oh yes, big debates, often quite heated. Should direct evangelism, preaching the gospel, come first? Or should efforts to civilize education, medicine, changing social structures happen alongside it? Or even first?
But both sides still valued Western culture.
Generally, yes. That's important. Both sides of that debate usually operated within a framework that implicitly saw Western culture as the benchmark, the standard to aim for.
So the goal broadened over time.
You could say that.
Yeah.
The overall aim shifted from just saving individual souls, maybe, to a broader ambition of creating a global, gospel-centered civilization, which, again, often looks suspiciously like Western society.
Okay, we have to talk about the link between missions and colonialism. That's always a sensitive topic.
Hugely sensitive,
Yeah.
and rightly so. It was incredibly complex and often deeply problematic. There's no single simple story.
How so? Were missionaries just tools of the colonizers?
Sometimes their efforts did align, intentionally or not. Missionaries were sometimes seen or even acted as agents or allies of colonial powers. Paving the way, perhaps?
But not always.
Not always. At other times, there was real tension. You had missionaries criticizing specific colonial abuses, exploitation, injustice.
Speaking out against the government?
Sometimes, yes. Though it's also important to say they very rarely questioned the basic legitimacy of colonialism itself. That underlying assumption often remained unchallenged.
And ideas like manifest destiny.
Right, particularly in the U.S. context. That idea further tangled up national ambition with religious fervor, justifying expansion, justifying the need to Christianize and civilize indigenous peoples as part of a divine plan for the nation.
What about beliefs about the end times? Millennialism, how did that connect to mission?
Different views had different effects. Postmillennialism, for instance.
That's the belief the world gets better and better before Christ returns.
Right. That optimistic view that the world would be gradually Christianized through mission efforts, leading to a golden age, then Christ returns, that really fueled missionary work, gave it purpose and drive.
But maybe a more secular view of progress crept in.
Increasingly, yes. Sometimes the idea of building God's kingdom on earth started looking more like secular social improvement, aligned with that Enlightenment progress narrative.
And the other view? Premillennialism.
Premillennialism, the view that Christ returns before the millennium, often to rescue believers from a worsening world that created a different kind of urgency.
More focus on saving individuals before it's too late.
Exactly. Rescuing souls from a world seen as basically doomed, rather than trying to transform the whole world system.
Okay, let's talk organization. The source mentions the rise of missionary societies. How does that connect to the Enlightenment?
It connects directly. The emergence of all these mission societies, run by denominations or even across denominations.
Voluntary groups.
Exactly. That flowed right out of the Reformation idea of private judgment, individuals interpreting faith for themselves, combined with the Enlightenment's emphasis on egalitarianism and people freely associating together.
People felt empowered to just start something.
Yeah, to organize themselves, pool their money and effort to advance their religious goals globally. It was a new way of doing things on a large scale.
And women's role.
Crucial. Women played a huge, often groundbreaking role in these societies, supporting them financially, organizing, and increasingly going out as missionaries themselves, challenging traditional roles.
What about how different Christian groups interacted on the mission field? Was it all cooperation?
Interestingly, the early phase of this modern missionary movement actually saw a fair bit of ecumenical spirit, cooperation, shared purpose.
But that didn't last.
Not entirely. As time went on, especially in the 19th century, you saw a rise in confessionalism again, denominations becoming more protective of their specific brands.
Competition.
Yeah, increased denominational competition. Different groups, sometimes prioritizing planting churches that looked exactly like their church back home, rather than focusing on broader unity.
And the actual goal of the work, planting churches, did that change?
Yes, there was a subtle shift. Away from the older medieval dream of a single, unified Christian world, a Christendom, towards the more practical, achievable goal of planting smaller, distinct churches, often denominationally defined churches in different parts of the world. The phrase often used was plantatio ecclesia, planting the church.
Okay. And then these faith missions popped up. What was their deal? How are they different?
Faith missions were kind of a radicalization of that voluntary principle.
How so?
They put extreme emphasis on trusting God alone for all their funding and needs. No guaranteed salaries, no big fundraising campaigns, just prayer and trust.
And focused on speed.
Often, yeah. Prioritizing rapid evangelization, getting the gospel out quickly, sometimes with less focus on building long-term institutions or adapting Western culture.
So, summing up the general feel of the missionary movement in this Enlightenment-influenced era, what words come to mind?
I'd say definitely a lot of energy. Missionary fervor, zeal, huge optimism, fueled by that belief in progress and human ability to actually help build God's kingdom.
And practical.
Very pragmatic, often. Focused on getting things done, achieving results you can measure, conversions, schools built, hospitals opened.
Even the Bible verses people used to support mission, did the emphasis change there too?
It seems so. Various passages were used, of course, throughout history.
Like Paul's Macedonian call.
Yeah, Acts 16.9 was popular.
Yeah.
But over time, especially as some liberal theology started questioning traditional interpretations, the Great Commission, Matthew 28, go and make disciples of all nations, became really, really central, dominant even.
Why that one?
Well, it felt like a clear, direct command from Jesus himself, a powerful, seemingly undeniable mandate for global mission whatever else was being debated theologically.
Okay. So pulling all these threads together, what's the big takeaway? The overarching impact of the Enlightenment on Christian mission.
I mean, it fundamentally reshaped the whole landscape. It wasn't just a tweak here or there.
A total overhaul.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
It introduced completely new ways of thinking about God, about humanity, about the world itself, and about the very purpose and practice of mission. It touched everything.
From church-state relations to missionary motive.
And how they saw other cultures, how they organized themselves, what they thought they were ultimately trying to achieve. It's all deeply marked by Enlightenment thought.
It really is a paradox, though, isn't it? Because, as you said, missionaries were often reacting against the Enlightenment, against its secularizing trends.
Exactly. That's such a crucial insight.
Yet they were swimming in its waters.
Completely. Even when they were consciously resisting certain Enlightenment ideas, like maybe pure rationalism, their own thinking, their assumptions, their methods, were inevitably operating within the broader intellectual framework the Enlightenment had built.
So things like individualism.
Yep. Individualism, the belief in progress, even if it was a spiritualized progress, the emphasis on reason and observable results, even the separation of public and private spheres. All that stuff profoundly shaped how mission was done.
Wow. This has been, a really illuminating deep dive. So much to think about. As we wrap up, what's one final thought you want to leave with listeners?
Maybe just to consider the enduring legacy of all this really complex, sometimes paradoxical relationship between Christian faith and the Enlightenment. It's still playing out in global Christianity today.
Oh, so?
Well, think about the ongoing challenges of cross-cultural mission, or even just cross-cultural understanding. How much of our thinking, our assumptions about progress or individualism, or the role of religion in public life is still subtly shaped by this history?
Good question.
Yeah, what specific bits of this historical influence are still molding how we understand and practice mission, or even just relate to people from different backgrounds today? And maybe how could understanding this history better help us engage with the world more thoughtfully, more humbly going forward?